Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Open Source Developers at Google Speaker Series, which is our speaker series designed to give the general public a better idea of what some of the awesome open source developers that Google has hired are up to in their daily lives. It is my pleasure this evening to present Ben Collins-Sussman and Brian Fitzpatrick, two of the engineers who work on Google's open source team and in their evening jobs are Subversion developers and, I don't know, just generally awesome guys. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to Ben and Fitz, who are going to be discussing this evening what's in it for me, how your company can benefit from open sourcing code.
Thanks, Leslie.
Hi.
He's Ben, and I'm Fitz. And we're going to talk about a couple of different things this evening having to do with companies and organizations open sourcing typically existing code base.
I think we should point out this is sort of a follow-up to another talk that we've been giving for years about how to manage an open source community if you've already got an open source community. But then we sort of realized there's this other demand that there are a lot of organizations and corporations that are thinking of starting open source communities or releasing code to the world, and they have a lot of questions about how to do that. So that's where this talk is coming from.
Right, so the standard disclaimers apply. These are our opinions. If you disagree with them, we recommend that you get your own talk somewhere else. Our target audience are against our organizations and companies that want to open code. And it's basically different strategies for open sourcing code beyond the fact that you're just throwing a pile of source code out there. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each, again, our opinions, and prescribe best practices for doing so. So to start off, why would you go open source in the first place? Why are you going to open source part or all of a particular code base that you have? You basically want to do it not just because you're a nice person, although you may very well be a nice person, but because there's some sort of gain for you or your company to get from doing this. Whether that's creating better software or creating a real relationship with your users, especially if your users in some case are developers, which is often the way that open source projects begin. And what are your goals? Are this public relations, or are you looking for goodwill?
Free labor is a big deal too, because a lot of times it can absolutely be the difference between releasing your product in 5 years versus releasing your product in a year if you've got 20 volunteers working on it. It just depends on how you're able to manage that. And then, of course, if money is not necessarily an issue to you, sometimes people will release code just to disrupt a whole area of market on purpose. And that's a great thing too, if you have the resources for it.
Right, it's hard to compete in some cases with a closed source product if an open source one is available and sort of commoditizes that particular area, especially if it's really good.
So when we talk about open source software, one of the things, at least when I talk with Fitz or our buddy Carl, when we talk about how good a piece of open source software is, we actually don't necessarily talk about the software itself. The first thing we talk about is how healthy is the community, because it doesn't matter if you have the best software ever written. If it's just sitting on a server and nobody's looking at it, nobody's developing it or supporting it, it may as well not exist. And so that's always the first thing we look at is, how active is the community? How active is the user community and the developer community? And that is ultimately the metric we use for evaluating success when we talk about releasing open source software. And you'll see that in the slides coming up. That's how we measure. That's our main metric, I guess.
Right, and again, as the slide says, usage, not users. We don't want a billion users if they use the product once to go away. We want people that are going to be heavy users. And that's a theme that you hear a lot here at Google. You want people who use the product. So usage is important. How is that community healthy? Active developers. You can't just have people that say they're developers who don't show up. And sort of constantly moving forward in one way or another. And if you don't have a community, you basically might as well not have a piece of software, because it's eventually going to bit rot until eventually some sort of community comes and picks it up and makes something happen with it. Because remember, the way that operating systems and just the state of the art changes, there's going to be incompatibilities that are introduced and changes that make your software no longer work over the course of time.
Unless you have someone maintaining it.
Right, and modifying and changing it, that sort of thing.
So why don't we talk about the first? You want me? I'll do this one.
The zeroth.
The zeroth. Well, of course, we're counting by starting at 0. This is the first approach to open sourcing software, and that is you put out a press release that you've just open sourced your code, but your license is not actually open source. This is not really a strategy, but we list it here because companies have done this before, and it's great because you get a little bit of PR. And you don't have to do a darn thing, but it's awful because people will call you out on it and you'll look like a fool, and people may burn your house down. So there isn't a lot of point in doing this unless your goal is to destroy trust with your users. That's about really the only long-term effect.
Right.
Of
I
this.
mean, we're not going to name names, but the companies you've seen do this have basically been trying to get some open source mojo without actually doing the work involved. And some of it's cluelessness, but some of it is actually, I think, somewhat malicious. But it's not long-term sustainable, nor is it really going to do you any good. So that brings us to the initial approach, I think, that a lot of companies did, which is to throw code over the wall. You clean up the code, you remove names from it, you get it approved by legal, you put the licenses in the files, you push it over the wall, and then you go back to your poker game. That's really great. You can get a PR splash, maybe, but the public relations foo you're going to get from that isn't from developers or open source programmers. That's going to be, you're going to get that from people that have no idea what open source or development is from. It's going to be sort of off out in the other world, possibly management, possibly users, that sort of thing. It's pretty effortless. It's not that hard to do this. The cons are that you don't have any community to keep your software alive. And if one does form, it's going to form somewhere way far away from you, most likely. So your software starts to bit rot. Real techies realize that you're not doing anything relatively interesting, and they don't give you any credibility.
Now, a lot of companies do this when they simply want to stop maintaining software. I mean, it's actually just sort of a cast-off technique. Like, well, the software is good. It would be terrible to let it bit rot inside the company, so we'll let it bit rot outside the company.
Right. So everybody else can smell our rotting garbage.
Well, sometimes if they're lucky, a community will pick it up and walk away and run with it, and that's great. But certainly, as a corporation, you're left out. Maybe that's what you intended, but usually not.
Right. Unless there's some revolutionary, interesting thing going on in the code that someone else can pick up and use, or codecs or something like that, but that's not often the case.
So the next level of, I guess we're numbering these strategies in terms of goodness, I suppose. And that is, you have a public code repository, so people can actually see what you're doing. Instead of a one-time push over the wall, you're actually pushing over the wall on a daily basis. All of your development is still happening in-house, all of your design decisions, all of your discussions. But when you actually make code changes, people can see it. And this is nice. I mean, you definitely get better PR, and you might actually get some volunteers contributing because they can track the code as it changes from day to day and say, aha, I see a bug, or here's a little enhancement, let me mail it to you guys. So you get a little bit more cred. The problem with this, of course, is that you're not really giving full participatory rights to these volunteers. And this is a theme that comes up over and over. We talk about having the bus keys, meaning you're driving a bus, and we think of a project as everybody sitting on a bus going in a certain direction. And if you don't let everybody take turns driving the bus and really having a kind of sense of stake or ownership in the project, you're not going to get great participation. You're not going to get really high-quality developers.
You don't get leaders.
Yeah, you get no leaders. And you sort of get drive-by patches. People will maybe walk by, give you a little patch, walk away. There's no incentive for them to stay because they don't have any sense of ownership. And
some people will stay.
Yeah,
but they're the followers.
They're the followers, and they tend not to be so helpful. I mean, certainly not as strong as developers who you might hire. And the same issues are as with the previous strategies, in that if the software is alive in the sense that you're paying people in your company to keep it alive, but you don't really have an open source community around it. If your company dies and goes under, that software is not going to live on. You don't really have an external community that you're participating in. Maybe a bunch of followers will pop up somewhere, sort of like a fan club, but it's not particularly useful to the project itself. And there's a general sense of distrust.
Right.
I mean, it's not a consensus-based organization. It's a corporation doing what it wants and throwing little scraps to the public.
Well,
so
your decision-making and your trust, your decision-making and your ideas about where you're going to go and what you're going to do in your general development is taking place in-house. The only way people externally can determine where you're going is by looking at your code, possibly your log messages, and they have no idea where you're going next. So there's it tends to be a bit of uneasiness, as well as general distrust. What is your agenda? What is your company getting by doing this open source development? Are you going to pull a rug out and change things up really quickly one day? Is it going to leave users or developers in the lurch, that sort of thing? So there's always that. So moving along, we have Open Monarchy. So this Open Monarchy development is where you have a public discussion and public repository. Your committers are mostly employees, but every once in a while, you'll give a volunteer the keys. Someone outside of your company will get commit
If they're really
access.
extraordinary.
If they're really extraordinary. And one entity, and typically in this case, we're talking about one lead developer. There's your project lead in the company that rules the project and makes all the decisions. So it's a very top-down organization. The decrees come from, on high from this one person, and everyone else is sort of implementers and doers.
Right.
And
This is essentially the same as the previous slide, except that the discussions are taking place in public. The company is still running the show. It's making all the decisions. It's just, at least it's talking out in public about what it's doing.
Right.
And you can see them making the decisions.
So the pros, again, is that you can get public relations benefits from opening this bit. You will get more credibility from techies because they can see that you're actually starting to do your development in public. And you will attract better quality volunteers because they can participate more. They can see more of what's going on. They have more insight into what you're doing. It's not a matter of, hey, do this or that sort of thing. They have a better idea of where your roadmap is. They can pick up new features. They can pick up bugs.
They can participate directly in the discussions.
Right.
Now, they may or may not really be able to affect those discussions in the sense that the corporate agenda will always win. But at least they can participate, right? And that gives them a little more sense of ownership.
And you wind up with better software as a result, with somewhat less effort from your part internally, engineering-wise. The problem is that this isn't a long-term sustainable thing. What happens when your company discontinues the product? What happens when the person who is the lead disappears? What happens to that leadership? There's a power void there, and there isn't anyone used to sort of filling that spot.
Or if the corporation just takes the software in a direction that really angers everyone, angers all the users or angers the other developers who are volunteering their time, and they're powerless to affect this new direction, then that's when we talk about angry revolutions. They may fork the project and walk away because they've got no vote.
And you still find that sense of general distrust there as well.
Yeah.
Which leads us on to
consensus-based development. This is the one that obviously we've been working towards. This is what we try to preach and persuade companies to go with. And it might be obvious to a lot of people who already work in open source software, but it's actually sort of shocking to a lot of corporations that haven't thought about open source. And the theory is that everything is public. All of your discussion, all of your code, all of your decision making, almost everything. Well, almost everything. Well, except maybe you'll have an internal mailing list to talk about, private agenda such. But the point is, all decisions are made based on the consensus of the community. In other words, the project is its own organization. It exists independently of any corporation that is paying people to work on it. And the people who are members of the project, they're the ones who make the decisions. They may all be wearing two hats, right? They may all be wearing a hat of the corporation that pays them to work on the software, but they're also wearing the hat of what is good for this project in the long term. Because, I may not always be working for the same company, and I want this software to live independent of my employer. And this is the shocking bit to a lot of folks, is that in order to join the community, you actually have to earn your access. And we have interesting stories where, for example, Fitz and I used to work at Collabnet, which was a company that sponsored the Subversion project. And they actually did a good job of building a consensus-based development. And we hired somebody, a friend of ours named Mike Pilato, to work on Subversion full-time employee. And he showed up the first day and he said, all right, where do I start committing the code? And we said, well, you're going to have to earn your access. Well, what do you mean by, well, you're going to have to submit patches and prove to everyone else in the project that you're worthy.
Including people that weren't employees of Collabnet.
Right, exactly. And so a bunch of people who didn't work with you, you have to prove to them that you are going to play by the rules and that you're a good team member. And, it's essentially like a second job application, right? Even though Collabnet's paying you to write this code, it's a separate barrier.
But what you wind up with is this isn't a slight to the people who are working on your project who aren't employees of the corporation. These people can see, they've hired someone, but that person still has to prove that they understand how our community works, that they have a general clue, and they're going through the same process that these other people have gone through.
But we have seen corporations that sort of are driving open source projects, and they do commit this, I call it a big mistake. They'll hire somebody to work on the software, and they'll just give them commit access instantly. And that breaks the social norms. It breaks the fabric that holds the community together, because suddenly it's not about whether people want you in the community. It's just about whether some corporation has happened to give you technical access or not.
Now sort of a digression on this is a story about our friend Carl a few years ago. So the Subversion community, we have a document on our style guide. We have a basically readability access that you have. You have to write our code in a certain way, you document in a certain way, you write your log message in a certain way, and it's actually an unbelievably obsessive-compulsive list of things that people are required to do.
But it's very clear.
It's very clear, exactly. There's very little question about what you should or shouldn't do as far as formatting the code and documenting things are. However, this is a way of inviting new people in our community. People understand once they come in how things are done. And we get volunteers from around the world, dozens and dozens of them, to follow this. They submit patches and for free, they're not getting paid. And we say, oh, you know, this doesn't conform to this, read that, make these changes. They resubmit, oh, it doesn't do that quite yet, and resubmit 5, 6 times before a patch is accepted. And these people are doing this because they want to be part of this community. They want to work on this project. Our friend Carl went to a company he was doing some consulting with, and you know, he was talking about using our version control system and giving consistent log messages and that sort of thing. And they're like, oh, you know, we can never get our developers to write consistent log messages. We just can't get them to do it. And Carl was sort of at a loss at what to say. He's like, wait a minute, aren't you paying their salaries? The guy's like, yeah, we just can't get them to do this. And Carl's like, I have 30 people from across the world don't pay a thing to, and they do everything that we tell them to do. It's because these people want to be part of this community. You earn being a member of this community. There is a barrier to entry. It's not a hazing process or some sort of abuse.
But it means something, right? It means that membership actually has a meaning because you had to work for it a little bit and prove that you were willing to play by the rules. Just as a sign of goodwill towards the rest of the community, right? It's not so much about hazing. So this is a great way to work. You get PR slowly at first, and over time it gets greater and greater and greater. It's gotten to the point now where I think CollabNet, that's their entire business plan, is basically supporting Subversion. And
they may disagree with that.
They may disagree with that, but I mean that is their central marketing and the PR now. It's like, hey, we're the founders of the Subversion project. Come to us, we're the experts. And that was something that took many years to achieve, but it is a long-term strategy, and it's really paying off for them now. Techies will give you absolute cred. You get the best volunteers, you get the leaders, the kind of folks that you would love to hire in your company. And in fact, that is what happens. In fact, a lot of the time is people who come into these projects, they get full ownership of the project, they really drive the bus, and a corporation will say, hey, we want to hire you to work on this full time instead of on weekends. It's a great opportunity for them. Everyone trusts each other, there's a lot of respect. The software is as good as it's going to get. I mean, you have the absolute best people looking at it, and everyone's doing it because they're passionate about it, not because they're being paid to do it necessarily.
Right. Now,
Why is it bad?
The cons of that is that you're not going to get a big boost about this from this right away. You're not going to get that sudden, like, you know, PR, woohoo, waving the flag, we released a bunch of code kind of a thing. But also in the short term, you really have to put the focus of the project first. You can't sort of start tweaking it and adding things to it and making changes that are going to suddenly give your company some sort of benefit. If you're writing a piece of software to accomplish a particular task or address a particular shortcoming or need, you have to concentrate on doing that. Results in better software, but it might not get you what you want as a company right away.
It drives project managers crazy, right? Because a customer will say, well, we need feature X.
Yeah.
Well, why can't we tell our developers to write feature X in the software? And the answer is, well, you can, but they're going to have to get the entire community to agree on this.
Right.
And usually it's not a problem. Sometimes it is. And you have to walk that line and be careful that your own corporate agenda is not coming before what the community wants or needs.
And as our president would say, it's hard work.
It's
hard work doing this. But you need to hire strong leaders. You can't just take a bunch of engineers and throw them at this project or this problem. You need to hire people who are designers, architects, coders, engineers. They understand algorithms.
And they have to play well with others.
That's the tricky part. They have to play well with others, right? So you're looking for people who are used to working in a team environment and can work with other people. So why do we think this is best? One of the things that we've sort of come to see over the past few years, working both internally at Google and other places, is that in the past, companies have isolated their developers from their users. Their developers can be more productive if you lock them in a room by themselves, give them peace and quiet and some music or whatever not, and let them write code. Well, my argument against that is if they're writing the wrong code, it doesn't matter how much code they're writing. So whether your consumers are internal or external, the closer you can bring the consumers of your code to the people writing the code and get a positive feedback loop as opposed to the sort of /you suck feedback loop, you can be more productive engineers and better software.
I think there's another reason that we at least think that this is the best is that it is the most long-term sustainable, in the sense that companies will come and go, individual participants in the project will come and go, but if the project is run well and the community is really based on this consensus-driven system, it will last a really, really long time. And we've watched this happen for good projects. I mean, like the Apache Software Foundation, right? With the Apache web server project itself has been going on for years, even though
12 years now.
People have come in and gone, and companies have come and gone. And I guess in a perfect situation, you know, there's a lot of similarities to what people talk about government models, right? A lot of people will say the ideal government is an enlightened despot. The problem is you can't always get one, and if you can, it's not sustainable, right? So people settle for democracy. And this is sort of a similar kind of argument. Ideally, there are projects out there where there really is an enlightened despot like Linus, or I don't know, maybe that's not a good example, but Guido, exactly. That's a great example for the Python project. Enlightened despot does a great job. Not necessarily sustainable in the long term. Maybe someone will succeed him, or maybe somebody won't.
You might get hit by a bus.
But yeah, exactly. But if you've really got a sort of a consensus-based system, you're guaranteed people will always step up, and the project will keep going. So.
And if you do this right, your internal developers will see the benefits. One of the things about this is that internal developers who aren't used to working in the open source world, they can have, we'll talk a little more about this in a minute, but they can have a hard time understanding why is this good. You know, people can be watching me work, and it seems like a waste of time. But if it's done right, they'll see the benefits of actually doing this from a software point of view.
This is where a lot of corporations get freaked out. They're saying, wait, you're asking me to essentially take my product and throw it to a bunch of random strangers and let them decide what to do with it. And that's one way of looking at it. It's not it's not a useful way of looking at it. The answer is no one's going to hijack your project. No one's going to force you to do anything. The way you make sure that happens is you start the project out with a really good, small core group of people who trust each other, who respect each other, who are humble, who work well with others, and who are going to attract like-minded people. It's really that small core establishes the culture of the product and the whole project, rather, and it becomes a self-selecting group.
Right, but to address the control thing, when you talk about community-centric, consensus-based software development, people immediately think that a bunch of weirdos on the internet are going to start writing my software and making decisions. You know,
that's the problem with the
internet. The world is full of jerks, except the internet makes it seem like they all live right next door to you. Okay, so the thing is that what you have to do, there's a lot of things you can do this. To do this, first of all, is you have to set the stage for your software development. You need to choose a well-scoped mission of what your software product is going to do. This is, again, a lot of this comes down to communication. Things that probably seem obvious to you and me, but in general, people sort of look past them because they're focused on the engineering aspect. So choose a well-scoped mission. Establish a culture of your project, preferably a respectful one. Not every culture is respectful necessarily. Set the tone of your discussion carefully. Don't be afraid to tell people, you know, we don't treat each other like that. Someone starts flaming and swearing and screaming and cursing, and like me, and then Ben tells me to stop it. You know, have a decision-making process. And a talk that we gave here last year that's up on Google Video as well is what is our poisonous people talk. It's how to protect your open source project from poisonous people. And that sort of gives you a lot of tips and clues on how to handle this sort of the chaos that's surrounding you and the rest of the world.
We're actually going to go into detail about how to sort of set up one of these communities now. I think that's where we're headed. So
but it does take work to do this. I mean, you can't.
It's a lot of work.
Just like everything's a lot of work. I mean,
I noticed, you know, at least with the Subversion project, it started out with just a handful of us. After 3 or 4 years, I found that I was spending half my time coding and half my time managing the community, and I don't think that was a waste of time, because it was necessary to keep it going.
Right.
Yep.
So a lot
Forking.
of people are afraid of forking. You've put your code out there with a free or open license, and people can actually take a copy of it, go somewhere else, start working on it, rename it, and just start doing things with it. Companies are freaked out about this. However, when you're doing consensus-based development, this is actually extremely rare, because if the majority of the people are happy with the direction your software is going in, And a minority leaves, well, so what? You've lost a minority of your developers. Certainly you don't want to alienate people in your project, but if 70% of the people are happy with what's going on and 30% aren't and they want to go elsewhere, maybe it's best that they go elsewhere and do what they want to do or try what they want to do. I mean, GCC did this many years ago with the Eggs project, remember? And what happened years later, they remerged again.
Usually forking is a sign of a dysfunctional community, at least many of the forks that I've seen. And you can't necessarily point the blame on any one person, but if your community is running very well and healthy and things are getting done and people are happy, there's very low chance of forking.
So if you're putting energy, meaning developers and people working on your project, and in general, it's operating in consensus, you're not going to have to worry about forking. So how do you build a consensus-based open source software project?
It's interesting. These first two slides are similar, but they're important. You need to come up with a goal which attracts people. It has to be something that you can give an elevator pitch and say, wow, that sounds exciting. I really want to get involved. Somebody who might just volunteer their time on weeknights, or somebody might want to join your company to work on this sort of a project. It has to be widely appealing. It might benefit your company, but more than likely, it's something that will benefit your company in the long term, not in the short term. It won't be, oh, we're going to get this little thing written for this customer next week. It's going to be, hey, we're going to change the industry in a way that helps our company, or we're going to help our product in the long run. Collabnet's a good example of that. They were shipping a product that used CVS, and they said, well, our customers hate CVS. Let's write a replacement for CVS. It's going to take years. Let's start an open source project around that. And many years later, it did pay back, but there was a lot of upfront investment that they had to go through.
And Google has recently done this with releasing the Google Web Toolkit, which is being done in a completely open environment and in a consensus-based model as well. So the next thing to do is to write a mission statement. And people tend to get all freaked out and think, oh my God, MBAs are in the room. I'm not an MBA. And business stuff, mission statement, touchy-feely. Yeah, exactly. And we're not married, at least not to each other. So you need some sort of a mission statement. Again, communication. Communicate in short, succinct sentence to any prospective developer who might want to join your project what you're about. And also, non-goals are important. You might want to list at the bottom of this sort of page that you've got, what are you not about? What don't you want to do? This way, when someone takes a look at your project, which is a version control system, and is thinking, I really want to hack this 3D OpenGL visualization tool into the core libraries of Subversion, you could say, we're not about that. We said specifically, we're only about software version control.
And if it's documented on a web page, it carries a huge amount of weight, as opposed to just replying to somebody on an email list and saying, no, that's not really what our community is about.
It's really weird how that works. If someone says, I want to do this with your project, and you say, well, no, we really don't want to do that, they're going to argue with you until the cows come home. But if you say, actually, we don't do that, if you look at our mission over here, it's on the page, they may argue a little bit, but they're going to peter out and disappear.
This is how you keep your community focused, right? You don't want folks coming along and diverting attention and trying to take you off your work by changing the route completely. When you establish this community, have a mission before you go in. What usually does not work, and I've seen a lot of this, say, on sites like SourceForge, somebody will have an idea for something, they'll start a SourceForge project, they'll invite people, there'll be no code, no mission, no goals, nothing written out, and the mailing list just turns into a bunch of people yelling at each other about what they think the thing should be. It works out a lot better if you have a small group of people who write a good mission. Maybe they have a little bit of code to demonstrate it. Then they go to the public and they say, here's what we're about. If you want to join us, great. If you're not interested, that's fine. But at least it's clear as to whether this is a community that you want to take part in or not. And you don't have to spend hours or days arguing about it.
Right, and people aren't typically malicious about this. There are plenty of malicious people out there. But people they want to participate. They want to get a part of the great stuff you've got going, and they want to do what they're interested in and what they're passionate about. And directing that or deflecting that, depending on what the case might be, is a really important sort of skill to learn, I would say, for any project.
Must preserve time. Must preserve focus, right? That's what we talk about.
Time and focus.
Time and focus.
I mean,
energy.
Open source projects aren't about cash. They're about time and focus and energy. That's what the sort of currency of the open source world is. If you like someone, you pay them by giving them your focus and time.
And this is how you protect your focus.
Right. So prepare your team. This book, which is written by our friend Carl Fogel, right here, is actually a great book to read. It's also free on the net at producingoss.com. It basically discuss the sort of the social bits and the nuts and bolts around building an open source project or free software project, whichever you have.
Mm-hmm. Thickening everyone's skin. This is a bullet, I think, that's pretty important, especially if you're working with a bunch of corporate folks who have never done open source software before. And that is, in the open source world, it is normal for people to review each other's code, to say, hey, you made a mistake here, I think this design is wrong. And it is not a personal thing. It's just people saying, well, let's make the product better, so I'm going to give you feedback on what you just did or what you're about to do. In the corporate world of software development, this is not normal. In fact, a lot of folks will say, well, this is...
In many companies. In
many companies, yes. It's hard to say whether it's the norm or not. We haven't worked in thousands of companies, but I've seen it in some companies I've worked in where people own certain areas of code and they make whatever changes they want. And if you dare to comment on what they're doing, it's taken as a personal offense. You've attacked them. And you need to teach folks that, no, this is, you are not your code. It is normal to get criticized, or to at least have your code criticized. Right. And that's part of the iterative development process.
I think it ends to be in companies whose primary focus isn't software engineering. They're using engineering as a tool to accomplish something. Mm-hmm. My friend Matt started working in a small company in engineering. He was really excited to work on this project. It was a very exciting thing. And he came in there and he did a code review, and someone submitted something, and he did another code review and another code review, and then the manager called him in and it's like, dude, you're really bumming people out by all this criticism all the time.
You're so mean.
I can't. Yeah, people are just really getting upset, and you're hurting feelings, and you're like, you shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. He's like, what? Excuse me? So it's open source world is very different for people who are used to being in sort of the quiet, calm, collected, non-open source world, internal.
Prepare your developers for that.
So once you've done that, it's time to move your development to the public. Launch public mailing lists, a public source code repository, bug tracker, again, communication tools. Minimize the use of internal mailing lists. I often recommend to people that they delete the mailing list entirely, but typically if someone's developing something that might be a tool or something else that other products internally leverage, they're going to have internal users that need to talk about it.
It is really tempting to slip back into the internal list, though, especially when a project is getting started. Now, it happened to us, right? When we started developing Subversion, there were just maybe 4 or 5 people, and most of us were working for one company, and we said, well, why are we having all our discussions on this mailing list and nobody's listening? It feels kind of stupid.
No, people were arguing. There's like a whole bunch of jumping and yelling and screaming.
And so rather than wanting to participate in the arguments, the discussion, we would just go back to the internal list and sort of make a decision. And we got called out on this. The CTO said, you guys are absolutely sabotaging the project. Do not do this. Stop using the internal list, period. And we fought and kicked and screamed. And we went back to the public list, and actually it turned out not to be so bad after all. Just quite a little more work on our part. We were being lazy, effectively.
And 7 years later, we're like, oh man, wow.
Well, actually,
we were kind of idiots.
A few months later, some of the best developers we ever had just showed up because they could see that there was some effort, I think, going into the discussion. Yeah. And it was really turning into something special.
So once you've got this, develop a policy for working with internal consumers of your project. So you don't have to, if someone has a question that can be asked on the public list, it should be asked there. And do some public relations, get some volunteers, don't be afraid of that. One of the things that I've seen, I used to be the vice president of public relations at the Apache Software Foundation, and it's got to be the most thankless job I've ever had in my life, because most engineers think public relations is a waste of time. They really do. They think public relations, they suddenly think all sizzle, no steak, and it can be sizzle with steak. But, some people never want to learn that. However, do some public relations, get some people interested, get the word out there about your project, and when it comes to like mailing lists and whatnot, it's tempting to set up one for bug tracking, one for commits, one for users, one for this, one for that. You're just never going to get any sort of energy or critical mass, I'd say.
Right. Well, when a project starts out, usually the developers and the users are the same people, right? There's little difference between those groups. As a project gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more popular, eventually what you'll notice is there are so many users who are asking for help or asking how to use the product. They can start to help each other, in fact. And it becomes a lot of noise to the point where it's hard for developers to actually talk about the development of the software. It's lost in the user noise. And there's nothing wrong with users, but at that point, that's sort of the point where you want to split your developer and users list and say, all right, if you're working on the software itself, come here. If you want to talk about how to use the software and help each other, come over here. And that's fine.
And we did that with Subversion. We finally split off our users from our developers mailing list. Ben was still answering a lot of users' questions, and one day we forbade him from answering email for 24 hours. And what happened is some of our users started answering other users' questions, and we realized, well, clearly there's
Who
other
needs
things.
us?
Exactly.
It was great.
So Ben moved to Hawaii and sat on a beach for a year. No, I'm kidding. So the summary of this, obviously, is you want to choose a strategy based on your goals. If your goals are just a big PR splash, then throw your code over the wall. Again, declaring something not open source when it's not open source could have your house burned down. Bad idea. There's always trade-offs. There's no black and white involved into this. There's a lot of gray area in what you do and what combination of these 4 different things you choose.
But the more energy you put into building a long-term community, the more long-term benefit you'll get. I think that's the ultimate trade-off. And the less energy you put in up front, the more the project is likely to just fizzle on its own, just fizzle out. So it's a risk that you have to calculate. How much energy do we have? How long do we want this to go? How much time and energy do we have? Yep. So I think that's it.
Yeah.
What's that?
So we'll move on to Q&A. If anyone has any questions or more helpfully any answers, that'd be great. Yes. Can you use the microphone, please?
Oh, wow.
They have microphones.
Cool.
So you guys were talking about the different kinds of open source projects they were. I was wondering, what do you consider things like OpenOffice and Asterisk, the types of systems that are, corporately controlled and you have to sign over all of your rights to the corporation? I mean, are those healthy for the open source environment?
Well, I'm not familiar with Asterisk, and I'm vaguely familiar with OpenOffice, but I don't think it falls. I think it falls somewhere in the middle of the 0 through 4 that we spoke about. And I think there's different ways. Like I said, there's different ways of doing it, and I don't know if one's sort of healthy or unhealthy. And signing over your rights, so to speak, I mean, that's sort of a separate issue, because even like the Free Software Foundation asks you to sign them copyright.
Well, in a lot of cases, it makes it difficult for other people that would contribute otherwise, too. I mean, like people like the Free Software Foundation, I may trust because they are the Free Software Foundation.
Sure.
But Digium, you're signing over your right. And Sun also, you're signing over.
You can't sign away your copy. I mean, we can get into legal stuff forever, but you can't sign away your copyright to someone.
This is a common
I'm sorry,
misconception.
you can assign
your copyright.
You can assign your copyright, but whatever, you give those rights to another company.
Sure.
And typically what those companies are wanting to do, Sun is wanting to make Star Office out of it. Digium is wanting to allow people to license the code and do whatever they want with it, and they're controlling that.
That's a philosophical choice of yours, okay? It's like there's a big argument, I think, between open source and free software, okay? And I've seen people within our company, open source on the right and free software on the left, and big fight in the middle. But so that really depends on what you're willing to do, what you're willing to be done with your code. If you don't want, to allow a company to relicense your code or do that type of thing, or a project to do that, you might want to go with the free software license.
Actually, a lot of companies will do this just for legal sanity, not because they're trying to control the project, but because contributor license agreements are actually just sort of a necessary evil in our legal system.
Apache Software Foundation requires a contributor license agreement.
You're not assigning your copyright. You're saying, hey, this organization that has the copyright on this code, I'm giving you permission to use my contributions in an unlimited way.
And there's legal reasons for that.
Yeah, and there are legal reasons for that, just because it makes it easier to defend the entire body of code as one entity, one representative.
What it comes down to, the answer is it depends on what you're more comfortable with. Personally, I probably, if there's something I wanted to write, I'm okay with other people using my code in whatever way they want. Some people are not. Some people want the code to be free, and that's the people more on the free software side.
He did mention OpenOffice. I've heard stories that OpenOffice is you're right. It's a lot of folks who work for Sun doing most of the coding, and I've heard stories that they aren't very comfortable working in a consensus-based open source, our ideal model. And that I've heard complaints about that, but it's all hearsay.
Let's move on to another question, though. So we can talk a little after if you're
absolutely.
Stick around. Other questions? Oh, here we go. Come to the mic.
Gary Little from Morgan Thaler Ventures once pointed out that open source makes it easier to couple the requirements from the customers to the actual development process, that you don't have a big heavyweight project management process creating big heavyweight documents that are then thrown over to development. How do you take something like a consensus-based development model and couple that to a sales force that's coming back into the office and saying, we can close this deal if we can just do this feature for this customer?
This is what we experienced all the time at Collab. Well, what you want to?
No, you.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is actually something that's hard to explain to sales folks. I mean, what do you mean we can't have this feature done by this date? And the answer is, well, we can try. It depends on how much influence we have in the community. It depends on how much credibility we have. It depends on whether this is something that everybody in the community wants for the product. And this is what you're right about. I mean, I agree with the statement about it brings the developers and the users close together, right? It removes all those layers, which is fantastic in terms of speeding things up and getting the software better. On the other hand, this is also that balancing act of trying to maintain control and yet not really maintain control. Your business plan needs to be flexible enough so that you have to give up certain things in the short term, like Gantt charts, right, and specific schedules, in return for long-term gain. Like, well, we know the project is moving in a direction that is going to help our company in the long term. We just can't make specific promises.
And there's two sides to this. If someone is requesting a feature, say for example, say you've sponsored an open source project, you've got it out there, you've got a bunch of people that don't work for your company working on the software, and one of your sales guys comes up, I can close this multi-million-dollar deal if we add this feature to the product. Well, the community involved in the software, and your internal developers will know this, they can gauge whether or not it's something innocuous or possibly useful that the community will tolerate if you contribute the development and testing resources to get it done. However, if it's completely orthogonal to the goals of the product, the odds of getting it in there, or antithetical, for example, the odds of you getting it in there are pretty slim. You're going to wind up with a revolt on your hands.
I think, that's the best way to describe it. If the customer says we need X and X is aligned with the project's goals, no problem. You'll get it quick. If it's not aligned, you'll never get it.
Because locking, locking for Subversion. Ben and I wrote the locking feature in Subversion 1.2, and most of the community could not have cared less about locking. I mean, they really like locking. We don't use it. Reserve checkouts. Who cares?
Right. It was there because CollabNet's customers said, "Well, we really need this feature for certain things."
Right. And we implement it in a fashion that's useful enough for anyone to use it. But
it wasn't out of scope of the mission.
Right. It's not out of scope entirely. It's a version control feature.
People accepted the feature, provided that CollabNet was willing to work on it.
Right. And that's what we did. We did have a couple of volunteers help us out somehow. Yeah. I don't know why, but just because they're great people.
Other questions?
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, my question is about companies like Google that do most of the things in-house, but some things open source, but actually they give a gift to the other companies. And they put a lot of effort and time and money to people to be involved in the open source community and develop, but actually they're giving some gift to the competitors.
So what's the question? Why do we do it?
Yeah, why is the balance here? I mean, if Google will put a lot of effort in open source, it's like giving a free gift to other companies.
Well, this goes back to your goals. Why are you open sourcing something, right? If you take the view that all software is some sort of competitive advantage, then no, you're never going to open source anything, right? But there are reasons to release things as open source. If you've determined that your company will benefit in the long run by everybody having this software, or by changing the industry by releasing something like Firefox web browser, right? It changes the industry. It makes everybody use standards. That's good for a company like Google, for example, right? Rather than, here's our proprietary web browser, we're going to keep it to ourselves and try and sell it. I mean, it's just a different way of helping yourself. Not all ways of helping yourself are necessarily,
Well, right, and I mean, a lot of the things
software
that you've seen open source from Google, you don't see a lot of software coming out of Google because that's typically driven by engineers who would decide, I want this to be open sourced. And we're like, well, okay, but you have to do the work. And they're like, oh, I don't know if I have time to do all that work, because it's a fair bit of work to get things out there. And again, if you just push it over the wall, who cares? Google does a lot of other things for open source. The product that Ben and I have been working on for years, project hosting on code.google.com. We've got Summer of Code, which Leslie runs, which is a fantastically successful project. We had 800-something students this year. 905 students, excuse me, paid to write open source code over the summer. And many of them were introduced to it for the first time. So there's a lot of different things that we do. And we do it because open source is good for us.
Right. I think Google Web Toolkit is a great example, right? So, some company might have come up with Google Web Toolkit and said, oh, this is great. We can make millions of dollars. Let's sell it. And Google's approach was, hey, this is great, let's release it. Let's make it easy for everybody in the world to write Ajax apps and thereby increase the amount of content and information that's produced and just make the web a stronger platform for everybody, which helps Google in the long run because that's how Google does its business, is on the web.
Right.
So it's just a different kind of strategy.
Yeah, if any more Google-specific questions, I'd ask you to wait till the end of the
Yeah.
talk, because this is more about open source in general. Thank you.
I had a question about your take on the role charisma plays in the success of an open source project. You mentioned Linus. You're both pretty charismatic guys. Would you say that having people who have whatever it takes to create a cult of personality around a lead developer, is that necessary or just a feature?
I don't think a cult of personality is necessary for a successful community. I think it can sometimes help, can sometimes hurt. I think it can hurt a community when the community it becomes dependent on that personality, right? If that person gets hit by a bus, then suddenly the community can't function because no one's telling them what to do. That's not really much of a consensus-based community. That's sort of the enlightened despot model that I was talking about earlier. It's not sustainable. But I think there are communities where there are very charismatic leaders, but the leaders do not actually have any more weight in decision-making than anybody else. They're more like figureheads. They're motivators. They're,
I think.
What do you
I think that any community that forms is going to start small. 1, 2, 3, 4 developers. And the community that grows around that, whether it's an open source project or a company as large as Google, and that community is going to be a reflection of those people that started it. And if those people are charismatic, friendly, respectful, and humble, and that sort of thing, you're going to wind up with a community that looks somewhat like that. If those people are assholes, you're going to wind up with a community of these people. The disadvantage to having a community built around sort of this jerk factor, I guess I'd say, is that tends to turn off a lot of people, and it turns them away before they even get to your door. And I don't think it's a wise decision to form a community that's likely to turn away a lot of people. And people get into a lot of, why don't some people come in open source? We've spoken about this at conferences. Why aren't there more women in open source? The average in software engineering is 10% women. In open source, it's 2%. And there's a lot of discussion around why that might be. And I personally think that if you can have developer communities that are more concentrated on getting work done, respecting each other, and working with people, I think you're more likely to
chest thumping and
as opposed
insulting
to chest
each other.
thumping, yeah, yelling and insisting it's going to be my way, and everyone else are stupid and dumb and whatnot.
That drives people away.
That does drive people away,
or attracts a certain kind of dysfunctional person.
Right, exactly. I mean, so if a community is built on a bunch of people who, there's a lot of hazing and yelling and screaming and chest thumping, you're going to wind up with a reflection of that. That's going to be your community, and you're going to attract those people. And I'm glad that there's places for those people to go, because I don't want to work with them. My opinion.
We have other questions?
Any other questions?
In terms of kickstarting a community, so if you're thinking about open sourcing some chunk of code, you talked about how do you decide who are committers or not? Do you take existing employees? I mean, because to try and follow your best practice, you talked about option 4. You're going to end up seeding it with employees, I guess, to start with. Is that how you guys did it?
Yeah, you need to choose employees who you think are going to be not just good coders, but good community managers. People who are nice people, trust each other, play well with others, are respectful of each other, are humble, are not crazy tyrants. I mean, if you find a small group of employees who are really nice to work with, people you would want to work with, right, and you say, hey, please start a community, then you'll get it's a good seed, and things will grow well from that. And I've seen examples where corporations will actually take 1 or 2 people who are jerks and say, please start a community. And the community becomes, as Fitz said, a bunch of jerks all yelling at each other. So you have to be very careful with who you start with.
But you find that to be okay for kickstarting it as
Yeah,
long as
it's
over
okay.
time you bring it?
They can be employees or not. You just need to make sure you're very careful about who you start with.
Kickstarting, I mean, that is the most important, to put the work into who is this initial core team, because they're going to define the team in the future. But yes, giving all those people commit access from the start is sort of the way you have to start. You've got to start somewhere.
You've got to start.
But you want to start probably narrower as opposed to broader, and again, choose these kind of things carefully. The other disadvantage, so one disadvantage of having a community of, well, let's say poisonous people, because that's our other talk. That's our favorite term of poisonous people. Is not only that you're going to turn a lot of people away, is that you're going to have a lot of wasted energy on arguing and yelling and screaming and chest thumping, and it's much better to divert and direct this energy into writing and designing good software. So,
Chest thumping communities usually don't last very long. It depends. Sometimes
they do. Sometimes.
I think they fizzle out.
Some of them have been around for a while. Any other questions? Well, we'll be around for a bit to chat. We'll draw to an end here, but thanks to everyone for coming.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are in the front row over here and those of you who ask questions, we've got free signed copies of Carl Fogel's book, thanks to Carl. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you.